In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head,
If the landlord can hijack the rent by 20%, that impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy. Max Golding and I are really excited to introduce Dawn Belkin Martinez from the Liberation Health Group in Boston, and also a co-editor of a really good book explaining liberation health practice called Social Justice in Clinical Practice. It's by Routledge. It's expensive, but it's a super book. And we would like to kick it off by asking Dawn, what led you to this model that seems so exciting?
Oh, thank you, Harriet. First of all, thank you so much, Max and Harriet, for having us on the show, The Liberation. I say us because we think collectively, and we are fans of the show, of the podcast, and I think it has so much to offer the movement. So, to answer your question, when I was in graduate school, a friend of mine, actually a friend and colleague, we were in school together. We had talked about, we both went to social work school. And as you both probably know, social work is what's called a value-based profession. So there's a strong kind of code of ethics that directs social workers to do social justice work. But one of the things we found was that, while we were getting a lot of information about how important social justice was and how it made a really big difference in the world, we weren't really getting trained to practice a social justice model in our clinical work. And both Nelson Ochoa and I, who started the Boston Liberation Health Group, are clinical social workers. We were pretty much trained psychodynamically with a little bit of CBT at that time. That was pretty much what they taught. So we felt like there was a really big gap between the code of ethics, right, and how to actually apply a social justice frame to clinical work. How do we address the issues of social justice in clinical work when there's no specific method for clinical social workers? And that, I think, speaks to the big in social work, what's called a macro clinical divide, right? Lots of times people that are focused on policy go into macro work, and they're working on changing laws and organizing community, grassroots organizing. And then clinical social workers do the work with individuals and families and communities. And so we really were thinking that this was a false divide, that, clinical workers needed a model to be able to talk to their clients about the socio-political factors that were influencing how they felt and their experiences in the world. So at that time, I went down to Brazil, in Porto Alegre, and met lots of people there that were associated with the Paulo Freire Institute, and had the great opportunity to meet with a lot of social workers there and learn from them, and came back to Boston and still communicated with them via email. And so they really were able to sort of teach me about a different kind of clinical social work practice. But of course, Boston is not Porto Alegre, so we really needed to sort of develop a model that fit, our particular historical moment and place, which was a big city, in Boston. So what we ended up doing was doing a lot of reading. In addition to Paulo Freire, we read Ignacio Martin Barro, who wrote Liberation Psychology. We read about radical social workers in the rank and file movement. We read a lot of Antonio Gramsci. We read about Black feminism and the Combahee River Statement. And what we wanted to do was to develop a model, a socio-political model for doing therapy, right, that fit where we were, which was in Boston. And at that time, I was working at Children's Hospital in Boston, which is a big, one of the Harvard-affiliated hospitals. And I worked on the inpatient psychiatry unit. I was the chief family therapist and social worker on the inpatient psychiatry unit. And one of the things that was going on there was that, children's, like many of the Harvard teaching hospitals are really into sort of research and doing surveys and patient evaluations and customer satisfactions. And one of the things they were finding at the time was on the inpatient psychiatry service, um, it, the surveys were not getting like the optimal sort of scores. People were sort of unhappy, and felt like they weren't being treated that well, and it was compared to other departments. The inpatient psychiatry department had lower scores. So luckily, there was a chief of the unit who was a psychiatrist. He was an analyst, and he didn't really know much about alternative frames of therapy, but he was a sort of open person. He said, well, if you guys want to try to develop something, go right ahead, and which is what we did. And what makes the Liberation Health model so special in my mind is that it was developed by really the families on the service, right? So if you think about organizing and taking your lead from the most vulnerable populations, the people most directly impacted by the injustice, that's what we did. And that's how our Liberation Health model came into being, because the families we work with taught us what sorts of interventions would be helpful and what sorts wouldn't. So we worked on this model, and we came up with a tool, which is our major tool, which is called the triangle, which explains everything in Liberation Health. And we formed our group about 20 years ago. And now the group has over 1,700 members across the country and internationally, focusing on social justice-focused clinical practice.
Really, what we're talking about, and I'm very interested in the parallels, because therapy is a liberatory experience. You find out how to live with yourself and how to be stronger and how to do what you believe in. And it's a liberation. And there's then another level of liberation, which you look for the social conditions that would allow such liberation to thrive. And I'm very interested in the segue between personal liberation and social liberation and how you negotiate that.
If it would make sense to the two of you, I can describe a little bit of the model and take you through what our Liberation Health assessment is like, so that you could get a real sense of how we anchor and ground the theory with a particular method. Would that make sense?
It does, but I'd also like you to show us through the application, because that's what I think our listeners are most interested in seeing. Okay, how do you do this?
Right. Well, that's kind of exactly what I want to talk about, because one of the things that makes the method unique is that it's an actual methodology, right? So very often, you read lots of articles, journal articles. I've read many of them, which talk about the need to incorporate a justice, anti-racist frame in the practice, how important it is. But then, at least when I went to school, I didn't read many articles about how to do it, right? So that's what we really wanted to do, and that's why the families were so important to us in developing the model, because we had to have concrete steps to teach people methods, right, interventions in order to sort of facilitate these liberatory conversations. So let me tell you a little bit about how that would work, right? So if you were to come in to see me. So I have a practice at the Meeting Point, which is in Boston, Friday afternoon. So I'll be seeing someone right after this. And what people know. I think for me, people know that I practice Liberation Health, and that's sort of in my little kind of bio thing. So my practice at the Meeting Point, somebody would sort of call me and say, I'm interested in getting some therapy, or seeing a counselor, social worker, and I'd explain a little bit about the model to them on the phone, right? I would say something like, so the way I sort of understand therapy is I think about not only are the personal factors, things that happen to you with your family and your inner sort of world important, but also the ideological messages, the cultural messages, and the institutions that you interface with. That has a big impact on who you are and how you experience the world. So Usually people are very interested in that. I think nowadays even more so. So somebody would come in and I would sort of start with them with the first step. It's every person that I see goes through the Liberation Health Assessment process, which involves the first step being seeing the problem in its totality, right? Developing, if I'm working with a family or a couple, a shared vision of the problem. So a question that I usually ask people in the first session is what are the things that are getting in the way of your optimal sort of way of living, right? So what are the sort of problems or barriers, or what is it that's getting in the way of you living your optimal life? And I ask people to make a list of that. And if I'm doing a family work or couples, I often say you can't put people on the list, which kids end up doing anyway, because, we're used to thinking about things in a very personal way, an individual way. So they'll put people on the list. And then the whole entire session is spent, reading through that list together and talking about the problems and sort of getting a deeper understanding. And then by the end of the first session, we jointly together, collaboratively, come up with one problem, right, that sort of is something that gets in the way of somebody's optimal level of functioning, right? So it could be loneliness, it could be depression, it could be like I'm scared, or I feel like a failure. I try to use the person's words as much as possible. So that's the first session. And then the second session involves the triangle, right? Then my son, who's now 32, would always say, the triangle explains everything in life, right, Mom? I'm like, yeah, because it does. It really does. So in this session, what we do is we construct a triangle. You don't need to be able to draw, just, a big triangle. And in the middle of the triangle, you put the self-identified problem that the person talked about. So it could be something like, I feel sad, or I feel like a failure, or I feel like an imposter, or I can't get, whatever it is, right? And then each point on the triangle is a different way to investigate the factors impacting the problem. So the first one is P for personal. And personal factors are things like, I don't know, any kind of illness that somebody might have, psychiatric vulnerability, any kind of conflict that they have with their family, any sort of self-concept, self-esteem problems, any sort of, developmental issues, right? So those would all go on the P side of the triangle, right? And that's usually pretty easy for people to do because that's the medical model, right? They're used to doing stuff like that. The more challenging points of the triangle to fill out are the C and the I, the cultural factors. And when we say cultural factors, we don't mean like where somebody's from or what kind of food they eat. We mean the dominant worldview messages, right, that impact the problem. So these are kind of questions about race, right? Like how might racism impact your feeling alone, right? Class, individualism, right? The culture of production, the culture of consumption, right? Perfectionism, all of the different sort of factors that go under white supremacy culture, not being able to stop working, sort of valuing yourself as, as how much you produce. Like all those kind of questions go under the C, the cultural factors influencing the problem. And then the final sort of piece of it is I, the institutional factors influencing the problem. So this is where you ask questions about the healthcare system or the criminal justice injustice system, or the housing system, or capitalism, or the transportation system. That's a big issue in Boston. And when you finish, you have a triangle completed with all these different factors that are impacting the problem. And one of the things that almost always happens after that second session is it's kind of overwhelming to look at, right? Because there's so many different factors impacting this personal problem that somebody came in with. But people frequently have the feeling of, oh my God, like this isn't just me. There's so many things outside of me that made up me, that made how I experienced the world really salient in this situation with the problem. And that is in and of itself it's an assessment, but it's also an intervention. And then the final step is the action plan. And we keep it really simple. We learned that from the families we were working with. They didn't want any Bronnenfeller, with lots of different charts and things like that. We keep it really simple. What's the problem? What do you think needs to change? What's your long range vision? And what's your plan for the week? Right. And then that is the 3-session Liberation Health Assessment.
Okay, so I am trying to imagine this happening, like doing this assessment process with a client, let's say an individual client, because something I've actually run into a few times is, maybe this is an orientation issue. Like you're saying that you tell people off the bat that you're going to be emphasizing a certain way of looking at things a little bit in the beginning. I've found sometimes, whether it's with adults or teens or families, that sometimes like I find them defaulting back on like, well, no, it is a personal issue and it is sort of in my head and all of that. And I don't want to like fight them on that. You know what I mean? I don't want to say like, well, like white supremacy, da 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 da, or like, it's like, well, your boss is clearly da 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 da, and so you should like organize your workplace. Where do you find that balance, or do you just find that orienting people toward that in the beginning, saying like, this is called the Liberation Health model?
Yeah, so it's and in both, right? So people that are coming, we explain the model that we use, right, to people, right? We're going to be looking at, and it might be that because, I'm a social worker, right? And so people that maybe want to see social workers have a little bit of that understanding. But we always say, we want to look at all the different factors that are impacting the identified problem. Right. So, of course, we're going to be looking at the situation with your mother. Right. And of course, we're going to be looking at, the depression that you experience. And we're also going to be looking at how the messages that you receive, right, impact that problem. We're also going to be looking at how the healthcare system impacts that problem. And I have to say that I think when that's sort of oriented right at the beginning, most people are pretty open, right? And maybe we just get a self-selecting audience. But I also would say is that this is the thing about it, we don't lecture people. Like, we ask questions.
Yeah.
I really learned that when I went to Brazil, that you're in this sort of dialogue and you're asking the kind of questions, and we'll get into that with the interventions in a little bit, that help people think about, how did you get these ideas, right? So you think that like all women are supposed to do X, Y, and Z. So how did you get these ideas? Whose interest is it for you to think this way? Are there other ways to think about this? Have you heard about this way of thinking about that? So you're not really lecturing people like capitalism is, I mean, for some people you do, you rant together because they come in agreeing with you. But for when I worked at Children's Hospital, that certainly wasn't the case. So we would ask the questions like, how do you think the fact that, you have to work 2 jobs impacts on your patients? Like, how do you think the fact that you're always worried about whether you can make rent impacts on whether or not you're going to be able to practice the anger management plan that the psychologist did for you, right? So we're asking the questions that lead people to sort of start to see the connections. And we have, 4 different intervention like questions that we use and we employ no matter what kind of treatment modality we're using.
Okay, sorry. This is my last thing, unless Harriet has something of, because
No,
I almost
go
want to play
ahead.
devil's. It's maybe not a devil's advocacy thing. I'm thinking of a family, like the last family I was working with, the most intense kind of multi issue family I was working with in community mental health before I quit, and how that's the exact. I mean, that every sort of social justice issue you could think of, whether it's like immigration issues, multiple jobs for parents, like crazy sort of misogyny, like trauma, like, you could just check every little box,
Right.
The level, the kinds of trauma, like sexual trauma, etc. And I got to know this family so well, and we'd have such sort of intimate conversations about so many things. But then I think, for like the mom, I'm thinking of, for her having to work 2 jobs and then having to have like 10 meetings a week with like CPS, with the rehab place, with us, like how helpful sometimes, again, this sounds like devil's advocacy, but it's just curiosity as off the top of my head. Like, could it make it, not like worse, but in some people I think are so trapped in that situation where like, to realize like, wow, capitalism and yada 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 is really making my life hard.
Mm-hmm.
But if they don't really have sort of an exit strategy out
Mm-hmm.
of the situation, you know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
could it could the
Yeah.
awareness sort of bring about more problems?
Mm.
um
Yeah.
it's a
Um,
weird thing hearing myself say this, but I guess I'm sure you've run
no,
into that as
I
well,
think
right?
it's a great question. I think it's a really great question. And what I would sort of say is that on some level, that people know, right? People know that all these things are going on for them, right? And what happens with them, right, is that they blame themselves. They say, I'm just a
Mhm.
loser,
Mm.
or I'm just
Hmm.
I'm incompetent, or, like, I just can't get anything done. I'm lazy, right? And so they know that all these things are going on for them. Um, and I think when you start to sort of help people sort of understand, right, how the white supremacy culture and production, and valuing some ways of communicating versus other ways, when you help people to sort of see that it's not inside your head, it's not all inside of
Hmm.
your head, right? um, then it can be somewhat liberating for people. Like, they're like, oh, like, it still sucks, this was really terrible, and it's not that I'm all bad, right? um, and the other thing I would add is that, we have a step in Liberation Health, which is called rescuing the historical memory of change. So we do a lot of work with people to help them sort of connect with times when people were experiencing so much oppression, and just, terrible oppression, and that people fought back, and there were the different ways that they fought back, and by rescuing the historical memory of change, it gives them the opportunity to begin to envision a different world for themselves.
What I'm thinking about is when I worked in a clinic, a family and child guidance clinic, we sometimes encountered families who brought in a troubled child, but
Hmm.
who really needed to hide the source of the trouble, like
Hmm.
family sexual abuse.
Hmm.
And I wonder how you handle that.
Yeah. So that's, this is not a sort of Pollyannish kind of approach where you don't, um, you ignore, instances of abuse or neglect or anything like that. That's not what this is about. But you do talk about, the different personal factors, like when you're doing this sort of stuff, the triangle that led to, somebody
Hmm.
being neglected, right, or somebody being abused. And but by understanding the larger context in why these things happen, I think that the sort of like intense like self-hatred, and gets shooken up a little bit, and it leaves the space for people to be compassionate with themselves in order to be able to make changes to do things differently. I wonder if a case example would give you a
It
good
would.
idea. Yeah, so um, I was working with this young man who came to the United States, as I think he might have been 6 or 7. And so his mom came first, right, which is very common in Latin America. One
Mm.
parent comes first, and then the child stays with the extended family. So this man stayed with his extended family for 6 years, and then he came to the United States. And the mom had met somebody new, and so he was living with like a new family. And the mom was very, very, very preoccupied with being able to sort of survive, right? And didn't have a lot of bandwidth to attend to him, right? And so he's here in this new country, learning the language. His mom is really preoccupied with working her job. Mom is also really preoccupied with the new partner, because that person takes up a lot of time. And so there were lots of ways that he experienced harm from his mother, right? Because she wasn't there lots of times physically, she wasn't there a lot of times emotionally. And so he developed many different complicating factors as a result of having this experience growing up. Um, and once we did the trial, we sort of, started working together, and we did the triangle, and he was able to, because he had a lot of anger at his mother for not being able to be there, and for in some ways neglecting him, and when we talked about all the different factors, right, that were influencing his childhood, things like racism and the immigration system and the wage system, right, that really positioned him in a very different relationship with his mother, right? Like, I mean, it's sort of like he now understood that, it's not that any of these things, the abuse and neglect, didn't happen, right? But they happened within this context of racial capitalism. And just that sort of understanding was the beginning of him being able to, he was an adult too. So of course, when there's safety situations, safety always comes first, but he wasn't living with his mother. So, but just the fact of being able to understand, right, what his mother was going through and how these factors impacted how she could parent really facilitated him being able to step into a different kind of relationship with his mother. And it's not like his mother still doesn't say and do things that upset him. That still happens because of, who she is and what she's going through. But, when he's talking about it, he'll say things like to me, like, okay, well, and when she was saying this, I just remember the triangle and how and this is the triangle sitting in front of me along with my mother. So I think that, obviously in issues of safety, that's the priority, and people need to get into safe spaces, and that has to be taken care of. But it also, I think, enables people to shift some of the anger and feelings of negativity that they have, right, to what I would say places where they belong, right? The larger systems that have failed these our families.
That makes a lot of sense, especially because if somebody is actually in danger of harm, they have to be removed.
Exactly. Yeah, of course.
But if they're not, and if people can see, and if your client can see the forces operating on the neglectful parent, he can at least see that this is an interaction, that he isn't merely a victim, but he's caught in a social situation that is squeezing him. And what that makes me want to do is ask you, how do you manage the segue between that realization of an oppressive system and activism?
Yeah. So one of the things that our group does is we are all sort of activists. We're activists in the world. I think I didn't mention there's three things that Liberation Health focuses on. One is, of course, we promote the model, and we teach other people the model. We've taught the model, many places in this country and overseas. And we practice the model together. So every other month, and now they're virtual meetings, so the two of you can come if you want. Somebody presents a clinical situation, or sometimes even something that's going on for them. And we together do the triangle, and then we break down in Zoom into breakout groups and come up with sort of action suggestions. So, that's one thing we do, but we're also activists in our community, and people are doing amazing things. We are sort of working on housing justice, working on sort of really stepping into our identity as workers, social workers, and the other people that are members of the group. We have a lot of consumers that are of mental health services that are members of the group. And so we're sort of anchoring ourselves in our worker identity. We work on police brutality, abolition, healthcare. So we are all involved in the movement. And so it's very likely that when we're doing things like rescuing the historical memory of chains, we might mention different sorts of activities that are going on, different sorts of groups that are meeting, to our clients, and see if they're interested in going to something like that. And again, these are always posed as a question, right? They're never like, hey, there's a big demonstration, are you coming? But it's more, right. I'll be there.
Yeah.
So, but they're more like, again, we have the first step is like, identifying the dominant worldview message. The second step is deconstructing the message, right? And those are the questions, who benefits when you believe this thing? Who benefits when you think this way? The third step is introducing new information. There's other ways to think about this. There's other ways to behave. There's other ways to show up in the world. And then the fourth step is rescuing the historical memory of change. So a youth that I was working with recently started to sort of have increased consciousness about oppression, racism, classism, and we did a little bit of rescue historical memory of change around what's going on in youth organizing in Boston. And now I understand, I'm not seeing him anymore, but now I understand he's part of that group and working with some of those other kids. So that's pretty cool.
It is. I feel like I ought to share this story. I had the only client I have ever agreed to see as an alternative to incarceration had thrown boulders at his ex-wife through the window of his ex-wife's new domicile because he saw her with another woman in a way of making love. And he threw a boulder through the window. And he had an enormous amount of rage. And so I said, well, if you have this much rage, there are socially constructive ways to use it. So, for example, there's a demonstration against the Klan, which is happening next week, whatever, and you can scream your head off, and be angry. I didn't realize he would throw rocks, of course. And I was really afraid that he would, if they caught him, which luckily they didn't, he would say, my therapist advised this. How do you negotiate that so it's clear that you are not asking them to participate or get carried away in a violent way? Because a lot of people have rage and are somewhat violent and therefore express themselves that way.
I think the way that we think about, offering sort of activism is like sort of any other intervention, right? Right? You could sort of, it's interesting because if you think about how hegemonic messaging works with mental health, it's fine for you to sort of offer to go to, say to your client, you should go to a yoga class, right? Or you should go to a meditation class, or you should take this medicine, right? Or, join this knitting group. But like something about like, well, maybe you might want to join a political group is somehow that's counter hegemonic. You're not supposed to do that. But the way that we think about that is that, offering suggestions and ideas to our clients, right, is something that we do all the time, right? We're constantly offering them different, you might want to sort of go to this stress reduction class. You might want to, take this, go model some clay. And that's one of many sort of activities that people can do, right, to help them manage their stress. And I think like any other activity, you would talk about it. So I'm just thinking like perhaps, let's suppose you have a client that has really significant trauma, right? Very significant trauma. And, closing their eyes, right, is something that can potentially trigger them and, into a rage or something. So if you were recommending a yoga class with them, you would probably have a discussion, right? This might happen at the yoga class. They might ask you to close your eyes. And what would that be like if they did? Would you get stressed out? How would you manage? How would you keep yourself safe, right? That would be something that I think most therapists would do.
Yes.
And this isn't really any that different. So with your client, you might say something like, there might be people there that are throwing things, and is that going to be something that's going to help you, get you closer to getting off probation? Or if you do that, will it get you further away? So you would have the same kind of conversation with them that you would with a client about something else.
Yeah. In other words, to imagine outside of my own idea of what I'm recommending, to imagine how it might be interpreted to a person who has violent reactions. Now, that's good advice because I hadn't imagined his style of protest.
Yeah, and you could just say, for some people, you could sort of, again, because liberation health, I think what I learned from, being in Brazil, that problem posing, the dialogue. You don't want to be the expert, right? So like, you know, some people when they go to these demonstrations get really revved up. Like, do you think that would be something that would happen to you? You know,
How
and
could you
then you,
handle it?
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Also, I actually found just asking a person, I had a very homophobic client, a guy who was really homophobic, and some guy came up to him at a truck stop because he was a truck driver and wanted a sexual encounter to the bathroom. And I said, well, how did you handle that? And he said, I ripped out the soap dish and smashed him in the face.
Mm.
So I said, well, what came between no thank you and smashing him in the face? What are your feelings about that? Where did you go? And he said, well, as a poor kid, I lived near a golf course, and people would give the poor kids, these rich guys, $10 to suck them off, these guys. And we thought it was fine until we realized what we were into, and I'm really upset about it. So we got a chance to talk about it,
right,
which was really useful. And I don't think he ended up quite as homophobic because he got some of the pain out that he hadn't talked about.
Yeah, and you might have even gotten to some of that too if you had done the triangle, right? And when you sort of like, how
Yes.
does, right? Like that, you could, and then that could be woven into the idea when he tells you he wanted to rip the soap dish off. You know, it's like, yeah, that makes sense because, you know, what happened, when when you were younger and how those ideas affected you. So it's like the triangles are something you do right at the beginning, but then you weave all the different factors into the ongoing work, whatever style you're using.
Well, he didn't just want to, he actually did that.
Oh.
Because I asked how he handled that upset.
So he actually did it. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's still a discussion.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the orientation piece, that's a term we use in DBT a lot, is like orientation and commitment, like that you don't really want to start the treatment until people like fully understand what it is, and you actually get them like sort of committed and motivated around doing the thing. And I mean, also DBT is a lot more, well, these days they're saying it's more like principle based, which I really appreciate and I think is actually true if you're doing it right. But I think it is a lot more like prescriptive and like we are experts than what you're describing. It just makes me think of that too. Like if you're doing a sort of conventional like talk therapy, like there isn't really like a quote unquote modality necessarily. You're just sort of listening to people, and then halfway through you're like, oh, we should probably do a triangle thing. I could see it just being a little bit more messy than when they come in on day one and you're like, we're going to do this triangle thing.
Yes. If you're not going deliberately for a liberation health reason, then you might ease into it. But I wanted to ask us all to define when we say initials like DBT, CBT, for those people who are listening, we should explain what the initials are for.
That's a good point. Yeah. So DBT stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. And let's see, I don't know. I don't want to feel like it's a derailer to really go into it. It's just it's a type of therapy that's designed to, it's most helpful for people with like really intense self-injurious types of behaviors like cutting or suicidality, or people who just have like really intense kind of roller coaster emotions and relationships, or at least that's what it was initially designed for. But I mean, I also kind of, since I'm trained in it, it's like a hammer that I happen to think works on everything, although that's not true. I could talk about DBT for forever, but back to the liberation health model. That's what we're talking about. I was looking at these interview questions that we sent you, Dawn, and there's a couple that I think might be kind of interesting to get into if you don't mind.
Of course not.
So one has to do with this idea of professionalized friendship. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this. I had a friend from years ago who was kind of opposed to going to therapy or just the idea of therapy. He thought it was professionalized friendship, and that people maybe should, or the way he thought society should be, is that people are able to work their stuff out in community and not need to go to this kind of like expensive professional to like sort out their stuff. sometimes for years, right? Because some people go to therapy for like 10 years or whatever.
Right.
And I've always felt kind of split on that, because I actually see there being a lot of validity to that criticism or concept.
Mm-hmm.
And also I kind of think capitalism, et cetera, has made society so fragmented and made people so lonely that it's kind of unrealistic to just expect that you can get the support you need within your family or your neighborhood or your whatever. And so it is nice to actually have somebody, especially if like your health insurance will pay for it.
Yeah.
But it's still like, it's like a legit concept on some level. Like, what do you think about that at all ever? Or do you guys talk about that in the liberation model?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're bringing up a great point. One of the things that I was struck by when I went to Cuba was that the social workers there really were able to, kind of like they worked for the polyclinics, which were the health clinics in the neighborhood. And they were also friends. They were, you'd see them hanging out and going, to parties and things like that with the neighbors because they lived in the neighborhood. What I would think, to answer your question, it's kind of like an and in both, right? Because so as as a as a revolutionary, right? I'm a socialist. I'm working towards a new world. I believe that we need a new world, right? I want to see a world where people treat each other with compassion. I want to see a world where, your self-worth and your self-concept isn't tied to this external thing, right? I want to see a world where solidarity is one of the guiding principles of how we sort of move, in space. And we're not at that world yet,
No.
right? We're not there. So it's kind of like, how do I, sort of as the Panthers would say, like, lead by example, right? And sort of how do I conduct myself in a way that, elevates solidarity and elevates compassion and elevates, principled struggle. And at the same time, I have some skills, right? So I have some skills that can be particularly focused and help people, right? So I guess I don't see them as two separate things. And I think even when we have the world we want, which for me would be, 21st century socialism, right? We're still probably going to go through times when we need to have some extra person that can help us, sort of think about things in a more structured way. I definitely think we'll have a lot less mental health right, problems in our new world, for sure. But I guess I don't see them as I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can conduct yourself in a way that that reflects the new world that you want to be and sort of be, come into the space with your friends and family that way. And, you can also get special help from somebody that has special skills.
Yes, also, it is true of a therapy relationship, which is something I like to point out, is that part of its great strength is you don't have to meet the therapist's needs. That in any kind of another friendship that's a nourishing friendship, there's an expected mutuality of caring.
Right.
But here you're being cared for, and you don't have to take responsibility for the other person.
Absolutely.
They're just there to help you the way you wish a mother did.
Or father.
Or father.
Right. Yeah.
Or father, to be less sexist.
Non-binary, right?
Or whoever else is a primary caregiver would not impose his, her, whatever needs on you. And that is a big differentiating factor that I think makes people feel relieved.
Right.
That it isn't just a friendship because you are being cared for. This is all about your needs, your position in yourself, your position in how you relate to the world.
I wonder if for sort of like closing ideas, thoughts, moving forward, just like with this model, if you see it, Dawn, as, I mean, it sounds like there's been a lot of growth in the last 20 years since you guys put it together.
Yes.
Are there, it sounds like it also started in Boston, but it doesn't sound like it obviously doesn't have to be practiced exclusively in Boston.
Oh,
do you
no.
do you see, I mean, are there like chapters, are there groups, are there like what does it look like as it spreads?
So this is what's so great about, being on the podcast. And so all people get to be exposed to the model, to learn about it, we have, if they wanted to, they could come, now that everything's on Zoom, they can come to our monthly meetings and learn more, participate in the case reviews, with our the new project that we're doing around anchoring ourselves as workers. So, it's interesting because it's so many fields of therapy or new techniques are sort of kind of conceived of within the capitalist frame, right? So a big piece of it is promoting it and, sort of,
Yes.
making sure that lots of people sort of buy the book and, sort of, just making, sort of it's a lot to do with, I think, the culture of professionalism. And I think because Liberation Health didn't come out of that, that isn't something that we've been focused on. We want to grow the movement simply because we think this is the best way, honestly, to practice healthcare. And so we are, we'll give talks to different groups, but we're not like out there with a commercial sort of frame for the model. So I think, people, if they hear about it, they get really excited, and sometimes they buy the book. Sometimes a lot of libraries have it, so they'll just download a PDF or something. But we haven't been out like promoting it in a sort of capitalist way, just because it's grounded in, sort of our political project, which is building this better world.
But if people would like if Max and I would like to join a monthly meeting, how does one do that?
Okay, so two things. One is you can join, there's a website, bostonliberationhealth.org, and it has articles on it. And I don't know much about technology, but there's different things on the website. And then you can join the super easy way is you can join the 1,700 other people on the Facebook group, which is Boston Liberation Health Group, and you just ask to join, and you'll see it's a very active group, and people are constantly posting things. And the meetings are monthly, so we have a meeting coming up next Friday. And we alternate our monthly meetings. One month it's focused on a clinical presentation, right? And then the next month we talk about our, social worker service project that we're doing, which is sort of, documenting abuses in social services, helping people develop their worker identity, anti-professionalism. That's an amazing project that we just started. So that
sounds lovely.
Yeah, so that's going to be next Friday's meeting. It's at 7:00 Eastern Standard Time. So and I would just say, feel free, anyone listening that wants to be a part, to join the movement. I think one of the questions you asked that I wanted to close with was that what to do when people get burnt out, right? Because it is, this is really a problem. And what we say in Liberation Health is that no one person is going to defeat capitalism. One person is not going to bring down racial capitalism. And it's only through being part of a collective, a group of people, in solidarity with your comrades, right, that you can get the strength, right, that you can get the support and the nurturing, to live a balanced life, right, of course, and then keep on keeping on in our movement to liberation.
And also to look for those nurturers in the group, because not everyone in the group is a nurturer, sadly enough.
Yeah.
This is wonderful.
I think also generalizing skills and rotating roles, to be a really like nerdy sort of group mechanical person about it. Because if one person burns out and other people know how to facilitate meetings or to write press releases or be a liaison with the press or whatever. I know this is like the nerdy, if you're doing like hardcore activism or whatever, but I think, that kind of stuff makes it so like, well, I can be burnt out for 2 weeks or 2 months and other people are able to fill my, the value that I gave to the group or the collective. Others have those skills as well, because we've been kind of training ourselves up.
Right. Building the multiracial movement.
Yes.
And we do have to stop, so we should just thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It was such a pleasure to get to know you guys, and I will see you on the revolutionary road.
Indeed.
Yes.
We'll wave.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And anybody who wants to contact us, and if you want to get it, you could contact us to get in contact with Dawn or the Liberation Health Group by emailing us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Bye-bye. And